Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Wells. I write horror, fantasy, and science fiction, and it is about science fiction that I wish to speak today. This is commentary day here on the channel, and so rather than review a game, I'm just going to talk about something that has been on my mind. And lately, that is Cyberpunk. Not the video game of that name, the very unimaginatively and problematically titled video game Cyberpunk, but the genre as a whole, it bothers me when people just name a thing after a genre. One of my favorite card games ever was called Wars. It tells you nothing about the game, and it is impossible to ask for or look up. And so there's no surprise that that game died a terrible death. But anyway, let's talk about Cyberpunk. Cyberpunk's been in the news a lot because the video game came out after such a long time, because the video game was such an overwhelming disappointment, riddled with bugs, failing on most of its promises, lots of problems with it. But what I'm talking about more now is the genre as a whole and my own quest, maybe, to figure out what cyberpunk means to a modern audience. There was an article that is being passed around a lot on Twitter, and I've been tagged in it several times because I've written Cyberpunk. One of my big science fiction trilogies through HarperCollins was the Mirador series: Blue Screen, Ones and Zeros, and Active Memory. And you can go out and find those. They're an ebook, they're an audio. The third one's not an audio yet, but they're in, hardcover, paperback, whatever your preferred method of reading books is. You can go read Blue Screen, and they're awesome. So anyway, the article that is being passed around is talking about how there's an enormous push right now towards cyberpunk. People are trying to bring cyberpunk back. We have never, since the early 80s, seen this much overwhelming corporate support for cyberpunk as a genre. We've got, Blade Runner, whatever the sequel, whatever number they have in their title. There's Cyberpunk 2077 video game. There's all these things going on all at the same time. Ready Player 2 is coming out really soon. We're seeing the tropes of cyberpunk, the look of cyberpunk everywhere. Synthwave, while not a massive cultural movement by any means, is pretty popular and gaining popularity. There's virtual reality is starting to crop up more and more. So anyway, with all of this massive push to bring cyberpunk back and make it a thing, it's not working. And this article is kind of bemoaning that and trying to search for the reason. Like, why is cyberpunk not coming back? Why is this big push just landing on deaf ears? Why do audiences not want it? And there's a lot of reasons that I think could be pointed to. First of all, even in its heyday, cyberpunk was always very niche. And it may just be that, people like me who grew up in the 80s with Neuromancer and William Gibson and the cyberpunk, the first wave of it, now that we're old and in charge and making things, we want to bring it back. But it may just be that it has an inherently limited audience, and it's already found that audience, and that there's not a larger one. It may be that we live in, and this is the article's contention, which I think has a lot of merit to it. It may just be that we live in a world that is already so cyberpunky that we don't need fiction about it. One of the lines from the article that I really loved was, "We read the cyberpunk, and then we signed the user agreement anyway." Cyberpunk as a genre, talking about near future and the perils of technology and the dehumanizing aspects of connected computing, tried to warn us about a future that we just thought sounded awesome. And so instead of taking those warnings and saying, oh, yeah, you're right, we are moving towards a world of corporate control and lack of privacy and grotesque technological dehumanization, and instead of saying, oh, crap, we should change things and avoid that, we kind of just accepted it. And now we're living in it, and it's as bad as Cyberpunk warned us it was going to be. But it's all just kind of blasé now, in a way. And and while I do think there's some merit to that, like I said, I do think that that argument has some weight to it. Honestly, I think that there are two much larger issues behind that. Now, before I get into these, I should say the reason I am talking about Cyberpunk on this RPG channel is because there's a lot of Cyberpunk RPGs out there, and I think that they're all really cool. There's Infinity, there is Cyberpunk Red, there is Hack the Planet from Forged in the Dark. There was another one that I just ran across just the other day, and now I can't remember what it was. And so, anyway, here's the two problems with modern Cyberpunk, in Dan Wells' opinion. Number one, Cyberpunk is about, very overtly and specifically, cultural rebellion against corporate control. It sprang up in the 80s, at the height of Reagan era, greed is good, business, politics, trickle-down economics, like the big boom that started creating all the billionaires. That's when Cyberpunk had its roots. And what the books are about are worlds that are controlled by corporate interests, and the poor little people on the bottom are trying to fight back against that. They're trying to live their own lives. They're trying to escape these other things. They're trying to bring down these massive conglomerates. And so, in a very real sense, Cyberpunk worked because the genre itself was what it was talking about. The books were about cultural rebels, and the books were also a form of cultural rebellion. They were people fighting back against the system, both the authors and the stories that they told were both kind of flipping off, thumbing their nose at the people in power. And now it is the people in power who are trying to bring that back. And they're trying to bring it back with all of its teeth and claws removed. Cyberpunk 2077, as a video game, has no meaningful critique of the future it is presenting. It is not a form of cultural rebellion. It is, in fact, a large corporation trying to make it a cultural norm. The same with every other form of cyberpunk that keeps coming out at some level. If it's coming from a grassroots thing, if it's some little nobody who's like, I just really like this art style and I'm going to do it, then it does feel authentic. But for the most part, modern cyberpunk has lost all of the punk. It is no longer punk. It is no longer resisting or rebelling against something. It is, in fact, corporations pushing it because they want to make money off of it, which is the exact opposite of what cyberpunk was. And so there's definitely a huge logistical disconnect at the heart of this modern wannabe renaissance for cyberpunk. The other thing that I see, and this is part of the same issue, but that was the corporate side of the issue. Now I want to talk about what I think is the artistic side of the issue, which is that the modern versions of cyberpunk, the modern, forays into it, are giving us the aesthetic without the heart. Even the ones I love, Infinity as an RPG, as a miniatures game, I adore it. I love to play it. I think it's super fun, but it is the aesthetic without the heart. Um, and what they're doing is they're saying, "Hey, look at these street samurai. Look at these, you know, cool augmented reality things. Look at these people with visors instead of faces. Look at this neon street punk stuff. Isn't that cool?" And the answer is yes, of course it's cool, but in its origins, that's never what Cyberpunk was really about. That was just the trappings with which they were telling their story. Neuromancer, which, depending on who you talk to, is kind of the godfather of all cyberpunk. Certainly not the first and not the thing that coined the term, but I think it's impossible to argue that it's not the great big godfather that made it what it is. The driving plot element of Neuromancer was that an AI had written a poem and everyone wanted to read it. That is amazing. That is, again, art. That it is a movement about art, about beauty, about not just, running through a street on your cybernetic legs or experiencing some kind of virtual reality, but it is specifically about what it means to be human and what it means on a very deeply personal and emotional level. Every book in Gibson's Sprawl series has art baked into the core of it. I can't remember now if it's Mona Lisa Overdrive or Count Zero that has a sculptor, but there's someone who is sculpting these huge godlike robots, not because they want to take over the world, not because they want to do anything with them, but because they are art. Because this person is making kinetic sculpture as art, as a thing of beauty. And we have lost sight of that in our fascination with the imagery. And, I've got one of the old Neuromancer covers right here. That imagery, the bright pinks, the neon colors, the melding of technology and human body, that excites us. It's such a neat subgenre of science fiction. I wrote an entire trilogy about this stuff because I love it. But even most of us, I think, are so caught up in that beautiful, grungy aesthetic that we are forgetting what made cyberpunk interesting and compelling in the first place, which is not just the visual appeal of it and not just the the slam bang action of it, but that sense of rebellion and that sense of art and search for beauty in a broken world. And so I look at those and I think, part of me wants to bring cyberpunk back to those roots. But another part, and I think a larger, more important part, says that that's what cyberpunk was in the 80s. That's the future they were looking toward, and that's the questions they were asking. And more than anything else, I'm starting to wonder if the reason cyberpunk is not catching on the way we want it to is because we are still trying to talk about the future people worried about in the 80s rather than figuring out what cyberpunk means to us today. What kind of future are we looking forward to? What kind of art do we want to see come out of the ashes? What kind of questions and concerns and worries and beauties can we look forward to in a future and extrapolate from our own presence instead of endlessly rehashing the present of 40 years ago? One person who I think personifies cyberpunk for me is Imogen Heap, the singer. And everyone has heard the song Hide and Seek, especially if you've ever seen Dear Sister from Saturday Night Live, which is one of the first and most famous of their digital shorts, where the people shoot each other endlessly. And they play the song Dear Sister by Imogen Heap. Now, Imogen Heap, in addition to being, in my opinion, a very talented singer and songwriter, she is also a tech rat. She has created gloves that are connected to a computer and programmed with a gesture based language that allows her to do sound editing live on stage. And I'll link to an NPR Tiny Desk concert where you can see her do this right there in front of you. She walks you through how the different gestures works and what they mean, and and then she sings hide and seek, and right in front of you with her hands she is sculpting the music and the accompaniment that surround it. She is adding echoes, she is adding reverb, she is changing the tones, she is creating and then canceling loops of sound. And that is the most cyberpunk thing I have ever seen in the real world. It has everything. It has the transhumanism of combining a human body and technology. It has the super high-tech, homemade quality to it. It has the beauty of the art that is not getting lost in there. It has the kind of grungy, not necessarily anti-corporate, but certainly a-corporate, where this is not a huge company doing this. This is not a multi-powerful, multinational lab that is creating this. This is one person who had a really great idea and got some friends, and they figured out how to do an amazing technological thing. That's what cyberpunk is. It's not necessarily what we saw coming 40 years ago, but it's a real thing that is happening today. And that's what I would love to see cyberpunk starting to depict. All of these tropes. I mean, Imogen Heap is not, to my knowledge, a cybernetic samurai in a neon street punk world, but she is absolutely an embodiment of some of the things that cyberpunk can do and should do. And if we can figure out how to tell stories using these cool things, extrapolating these, all of us who were trying to write cyberpunk for decades, and all we came up with was just the same rehashed stuff of Neil Stephenson and William Gibson and all these other people, and then here comes Imogen Heap and shows us something truly new and astounding. That's what cyberpunk needs to be. Now, I am still going to play the Infinity RPG. I'm still going to play Hack the Planet. I'm still going to enjoy all of these wonderful cyberpunk aesthetics and adventures and things. But I am also going to be thinking really long and really hard about how to make cyberpunk modern and relevant instead of just nostalgic and cool. And I don't have a solid answer yet of what that's going to look like, but I suspect it's going to look a lot more like Imogen Heap than Cyberpunk 2077. Anyway, thanks for watching this video. My name is Dan Wells. I'm a horror, science fiction, fantasy author, and you can read my books. I'm also a professional game master, and I can run a game for you while you are reading my books. How about that? Anyway, thanks for watching. I'm Dan Wells, and you are awesome.